Welcome to this video, which is part of the first online Tilted Conference 2023 towards intersectionality in language teacher education first steps. This was a conference held online on the 17th of November 2023. Tilted is a research group based at Moray House School of Education and Sport, University of Edinburgh. It sits within the Language, Interculturality and Literacy's thematic hub. The aim of this first online conference was twofold. One, to learn from researchers based in Scotland who have carried out work in the area of intersectionality, and two, to discuss the ways in which such work can help embed an intersectionality perspective in the area and practice of language teacher education. The conference featured 4 speakers. In this video, you will watch the presentation delivered by Dr. Deniz Ortaçtepe Hart, lecturer in TESOL at the School of Education, University of Glasgow. The title of her presentation was Conceptualizing the What and How of Unlearning an Intersectional Perspective.
And thanks everyone for being here today. I will be talking about an ongoing study on unlearning and how to conceptualize unlearning from an intersectional perspective, or at least that was my original goal. However, after almost a year of engaging with this research, collecting data, analyzing data, I came to realize that I was questioning more and more the concept of unlearning. So perhaps this is no longer the best title for this study. And my new title, given where the study is going, perhaps is Time to Unlearn Unlearning. So here's the background of the study. Given the increased attention in higher education institutions towards anti-racism, decolonization, multicultural education, internalization, we have seen a proliferation of language teacher education programs with a social justice orientation. So as I said in the morning, I'm still new to the UK context, but if you look at the teacher education programs in the States, you will not be able to find a program, and this is of course exaggeration, with no social justice orientation. If you look at their mission, vision, change the world, diversity, equity, inclusion. So you all see these words, and they all seem to be on board with this idea, yet we are still facing these hierarchies and inequalities. There is this increased attention towards social justice education, but this is by no means a new phenomenon, and maybe it goes even further back than critical pedagogy and Freire. About 25 years ago, McLaren and Fishman said that if teacher education wants to meet the educational tasks demanded by the global information age, we need to, as teacher educators, we need to develop new languages of criticism and interpretation inspired by innovation in Marxian, feminist, and anti-colonial scholarship and activism, and a revolutionary praxis that refuses to compromise its commitment to the imperatives of emancipation and social justice. However, despite this vast literature on social justice teacher education, we're still unclear in terms of what actually it means and what it entails. So according to MacDonald and Zehner, if social justice teacher education is to become more than rhetoric and more than a mere celebration of diversity, and what we talked about, in relation to performativity and tokenism, we need to explore what it means to prepare teachers for social justice, what program content, structure, practices are needed, and which community partners and stakeholders to collaborate with. And it's not it's not only that there is this conceptual ambiguity around social justice teacher education and what it means, but the term social justice is contested, and there are, you know, various definitions, and maybe, like, you know, very little consensus in regards to what it means. And I'm not going to give a list of definitions here. I don't think we have, you know, time for, you know, any of that. But one particular definition that drew my attention was that social justice is a continuum of learning, unlearning, and relearning. And I don't necessarily agree with this, you know, definition. I don't think it helps us understand social justice, but I was curious about this particular definition, actually, especially in relation to this research. So in this study, I wanted to address this conceptual and pedagogical ambiguity around social justice teacher education. And my larger goal when I set out was to understand what language teachers who took the language teaching for social justice course that I offered in my previous institution in the States, what they learned out of the course, what they relearned, and what they unlearned, like to be able to see the, you know, like this big picture, and to be able to understand what is it that we are doing as part of social justice teacher education. Then I started focusing more on unlearning, and I'll explain why. So I've started to come across experiences, you know, attending anti-racist trainings where white women in leading roles talked about, you know, how they got into this work, what experiences that they have had so far, and often, like, you know, ending this positionality statement with, since then it's been a journey of learning, relearning, and unlearning. And every time I hear that, I pause. I'm like, okay, so what is it that you unlearned? Let's talk about that, because if we are using unlearning to justify our position in a space that maybe we shouldn't be, then we need to understand that concept, and we need to, like, you know, deconstruct it, and we need to, like, you know, get to the bottom of it. As I was preparing this presentation, I actually came across different appropriations of unlearning. So in 2017, the University of Sydney launched a campaign, you know, around the concept unlearning. So I would like to show a brief video. Hopefully you see the YouTube page. Yeah, okay. Let's make this video. Go back to the PowerPoint. So you see, like, you know, here unlearning is, like, you know, used and appropriated in totally, like, different way, like, you know, unlearning sleep, unlearning diet, and they have, like, you know, a variety of these videos, like unlearning truth and unlearning, yeah, like health and etc. And they even held a conference last year on unlearning the future, which I was, like, really interested, you know, I'm curious to see. And unlearning even entered the vocabulary of the corporate world, and I came across this unlearning, the missing link in sales connection. So how do we unlearn to increase our sales? Interesting, right? So when you look at the literature, going back to the academic world, unlearning has been used in different contexts in relation to different vocabulary. So unlearning privilege, unlearning whiteness, unlearning colorblindness, racism, colonial practices, mindsets, stereotypes, biases, beliefs, assumptions, privilege, and oppression. And in my book, I talked about unlearning as one's as the process of unpacking and re-examining one's beliefs and assumptions in relation to the roles and privilege that they hold in a given society. So the problems with previous definitions of unlearning is that they almost always describe unlearning as an individual process of unlearning privilege and unlearning assumptions, unlearning beliefs. So it revolves around this discourse of self-awareness and reflection, and it's almost again always unidimensional, like one-dimensional. The discourse is mostly around racism and anti-racist work. So, again, as I talked about, unlearning white privilege, unlearning colorblindness, and so on. I found one study that looked at unlearning heterosexism. And then there was another study that looked at unlearning internalized oppression. And then just one study that looked at, a more intersectional perspective of unlearning, looking at, race and class simultaneously. So in my study, my starting questions, the guiding questions were that, is unlearning a discourse, a theory, a concept, a helpfully or unhelpfully catch-all term, or all of these? Is teacher unlearning an observable and measurable phenomenon? Not that I argue that everything should be measurable and observable. So what outcomes emerge at classroom and societal levels as a result of unlearning? And then how and even whether unlearning happens, and if it does, what does it look like? So the focus of the study was the course that I taught at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And the course underlined the principles of critical pedagogy and also underlined intersectionality. So we drew from frameworks of environmental justice, feminist pedagogies, queer pedagogies, anti-racist education, and political economy and anti-classism. The participants were the students who took the course, and they were about, 20 of them actually agreed to participate in the study, and they were teaching different languages, so not necessarily English, but also there was a teacher of Arabic, Spanish, French, and then you'll see how actually that added a nice angle to the results. Two of the participants were Chinese, one Japanese, one Jewish American, two African American, and the rest of the participants were white identifying. And the participants were also diverse in terms of class, sexuality, and neurodiversity. So the data consisted of the students' coursework data. There were lots of reflection papers and lesson plans and materials development projects that they produced over the time of the course. I need to mention that I taught the course every fall semester between 2019 and 2022. And 16 of them completed the questionnaire, the open-ended questionnaire and the interviews. So I need to add a note here that throughout the questionnaire and also the interviews, I didn't ask students that, what's unlearning, right? Or like, can you tell me an experience that you unlearned, or until the very end. So some of the students, the participants, they were very informed, they knew unlearning, so they used it, on their own without my prompt. But, until the very end, I didn't mention. And anyways, like my broader scope was like to understand what they gained out of the course. So, I didn't particularly focus on learning, but then, as I mentioned, my focus like shifted from that bigger picture to the narrower angle of like, what unlearning is. I was the course instructor and also the researcher, but at the time of the questionnaire and the interviews, we didn't have that kind of a relationship, that the students had already completed their coursework and completed, received their grades. The course, in terms of dismantling the power dynamics between the course instructor and the students, the course did not only talk about critical pedagogy, but critical pedagogy was weaved into how we did course activities and how we did the assessments and so on. So it was an intentional process of dismantling the power relations with the students. And then there was a lot of privilege and vulnerability involved on my behalf that I am happy to talk more about maybe during the question and answer. So as part of the data analysis, I had several guiding questions. So I was curious to see what unlearning meant for them. And I was also curious to see, if unlearning was something that they talked about or referred to in relation to only racism, or that, or they also talked about different aspects of unlearning in regard to their intersectional identities. And I was also curious to see what experiences they had that indicates that they might have unlearned racism and privilege and biases and so on. So looking at the preliminary results, what I have found, and I put question marks here, that this wasn't, so because I didn't ask students to tell me their experiences of unlearning, right? So this is my own interpretations of unlearning using the previous literature. So trying to get hints of unlearning or what unlearning might have looked like in their lives. So that's why I do have question marks in most of these themes here, because I'm not really sure that they indicate unlearning. And that's that's where I'm going with this research, that maybe this is not a very helpful concept. So looking at, for instance, unlearning as getting out of one's bubble, Eve mentioned that, actually it wasn't only Eve, a few of the participants mentioned how they lived until they went to college in this white bubble, that, they went to white schools, they had white friends, and they had white teachers and white neighbors, and I think you get the picture. So Eve said that I was blind to some of the racism that my peers experienced in our youth. This was never a conversation that my parents had to have with me when I was a teenager. So there is this aspect of getting out of the bubble, but we don't know what that means. So maybe in particularly that's more about self-awareness. So Anna mentioned that when I'm with friends, I sometimes use African American vernacular English expressions, grammar, and pronunciation. I've heard from podcasts on online articles that this can be offensive, because I'm just casually opting the language because I like it. I've never had to face discrimination because of my variety of English. Around my Black friends, sometimes AAV slips out, and I wonder how they feel about it, but I'm afraid to ask. So if we think about unlearning as as our beliefs removed from our brain, then it doesn't hold up here, right? This participant is aware that the use of AAVE as a white person, can be problematic. So there is the awareness there, but then there is, when it comes to action or behaviors, she tries not to use AAVE with her Black friends, but it still slips out. So maybe unlearning doesn't happen or maybe it happens in bits and pieces, but because racism is so ingrained in our lives, I don't know if there is a point that she stops using AAVE. The next one is a very long quotation. I'll set up the stage, but I'll give you a few minutes to read it. It's really intense, but it's really good. So I didn't want to chop it into pieces. So in this one, this is an Arabic class, and it's a predominantly Black school, but the Arabic teacher is white. So in this particular class, the students were playing Jeopardy, an information, I guess, knowledge game to review for an exam, and the students were in teams with their classmates. One student at this young man's table got the answer wrong, and this is what happened next. So I'll just give you some time to read. You can give me a hint when you're done reading. That'll be helpful. So again, this one is very interesting, and this participant was intentionally thinking about her privilege, her whiteness, and her role in the class, but still it's really complex, right? Like, how do you manage different different roles and different relations in this context? Again, like, is this an experience of unlearning? This is a very significant experience, maybe a critical experience, or critical incident that we call, but I'm not sure if it shows that there's unlearning, or if it goes beyond just questioning one's beliefs or one's positionality. Another experience in relation to unlearning internalized oppression. So this participant mentioned that as a gay man who has been out and proud for the last 23 years, I'm fortunate to have dealt with the grand majority of internalized heterosexism and homophobia that I had been taught by the US society for the first 18 years of my life in rural Colorado. Even so, there are always moments when those oppressive ideas can creep back in unexpected ways. When they do happen, I stop myself, I analyze what's going on, address it, and move forward. And again, we see this yes, I've unlearned some of it, but maybe it's still there, it's still ingrained, and it still creeps in. That's maybe that's a very key word here. And then another participant talk about unlearning internalized oppression in relation to ableism and heteronormativity. So she said, I struggle and work through my own complicated feelings about my disability and how that has both held me back and helped me over the years, including hating myself for asking for help when I needed, and even questioning whether or not my sexuality is true because I've never dated a woman. So lastly, there was one participant that mentioned unlearning as a lifelong process. And maybe this one was the one that, again, this was her own language, that she said, in the course, I found the readings to be a powerful tool in understanding what I needed to unlearn. Unlearning to me is a difficult, non-linear, and lifelong process. In this course, I started the process of unlearning the impact that my silence had on my community. So maybe like, I agree, like unlearning, it's very difficult. It's non-linear. It's a lifelong process. It's definitely not a one-off. But then like, the second part of the quote that, unlearning the impact of my silence is really something to think about. So here I am after I still have lots of data to analyze, but my current stance is that, is it worth reconceptualizing unlearning from an intersectional perspective, or should we just, rip it up, tear it apart, and move forward? And I do have, and like part of the problem is that, I try to visualize it, that if unlearning is something that happens at the individual level and at the level of like, self-awareness and reflection, maybe it's not very helpful for us to talk about unlearning. Maybe it just like, becomes a performative act that we talk about, unlearning to, to take up space. And we need to think about like what the implications of that language is, and how we can move from that language, from at least its narrow understanding, to to a more structural concept or a stance. And I'm not saying that we should like come up with a new alternative term, but just like changing our mindset towards a language that will help us like move forward towards action and transformation. So Dario had asked us to include one question at the end of our presentation. So I included these two questions that if we have time, maybe in the discussion session we can talk about them. That why has unlearning become such a buzzword, and that what is the harm in continuing to use the term unlearning? Yeah, thanks for listening.